The sun had not yet cleared the ridge when Ada Keller heard the voice that would change everything. "What's your name?" She spun around, her hand pressing flat against the rough timber wall of the Dusty Creek General Store, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The man standing 10 feet away from her was not looking at her. He was looking at the man across the street, the man who had been following her for 3 days, the man with the silver hatband and the dead eyes, and the message from her brother that she had been dreading since she crossed the Texas line. And yet the question had been addressed to her. She could tell because the gunfighter's eyes, dark, impossible to read, the color of river stone after a flood, had flicked to her for just one breath of a second before returning to the man across the street. "Tell me your name," he said again, and this time it was absolutely clear he was speaking to her, not to the man with the drawn pistol, not to the gathering crowd of people melting backward into doorways and alley shadows, to her. "Before this gets settled, tell me your name." Ada's mouth opened. She did not understand why it mattered. She did not understand why a man about to step into a duel in the middle of a dirt street in Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory in the year 1882, would need the name of a woman he had never met. But something in his voice was not casual. Something in the way he asked made it sound like he was asking her to give him a reason. "Ada," she said. "Ada Keller." He nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement, and then he turned back to the man across the street, and everything happened so fast that she barely registered the motion of his hand before the gunshot split the morning air like an axe through green wood. The man with the silver hatband dropped, and the gunfighter, steady, unhurt, dust still swirling around his boots, turned back to her and said her name like he had been carrying it for years. "Ada Keller," he said. "You'd better get inside." To understand why that moment cracked something open inside her that had been sealed shut for 2 years, you have to understand what Ada Keller had survived to get to Dusty Creek. She had grown up in a small ranching community outside of Abilene, Kansas, the daughter of Heinrich Keller, a German immigrant who had built a modest but honest life on 70 acres of difficult land, and Miriam Keller, née Hartman, a woman so quietly fierce that Ada had never once seen her weep, not even when Heinrich died of a chest sickness in the winter of 1878. Ada had been 19 then. Her younger brother, Thomas, had been 17. And the decision Miriam Keller made in the weeks following her husband's death to sell the land, pack what they could carry, and move south toward the territories where a cousin had supposedly staked a claim was a decision that had put every one of them on a path that ended in Dusty Creek. The cousin's claim turned out to be nothing. The land was disputed. The cousin himself was dead before they arrived, killed in a property argument that the local law had decided was not worth investigating. Thomas, who had always had more fire than patience, had gotten tangled up in the same argument on the same land, and by 1880, when he was 19 years old, he had crossed a line from which there was no uncrossing. He had shot a man. Not killed him, but shot him, in defense of what he genuinely believed was their rightful inheritance. The man he shot happened to work for a cattle baron named Harlan Cruz, who controlled most of the grazing rights between the Pecos River and the Sacramento Mountains, and Harlan Cruz was not a man who accepted injury to his employees without a response. Miriam had died in the summer of 1880, her heart giving out 2 months after Thomas disappeared. Ada never knew if it was grief or relief that killed her mother. She suspected both. She had spent a year in Abilene after that, working as a seamstress, saving what she could, trying to find news of Thomas through letters and the occasional traveler passing through from the south. Most of the news was bad. Thomas was running with a rough group. Thomas had been seen near the border. Thomas had sent a message through a freight driver that he needed money to get to California and start over. And then, 3 weeks before Ada arrived in Dusty Creek, Thomas had sent a different kind of message. Not through a freight driver this time. Through one of Harlan Cruz's men, delivered with a bruised jaw and a tone that made it unmistakably clear that it was not a request. Bring money or bring yourself to Dusty Creek by the 1st of October, the message said. Otherwise, your brother learns what it means to be an example. Ada had no money worth speaking of. She had the clothes on her back, her mother's silver brooch, and a determination that had been forged in the same furnace as Miriam Keller's quiet fierceness. She had no one to turn to and no plan. She only had the date, the town, and the stubborn refusal to let her last living family member disappear into the ground, because she had not at least tried. She arrived in Dusty Creek on September the 29th, 2 days before the deadline, with no idea what she was going to do. She had not expected the gunfighter. She did not even know his name the morning he stepped in front of the man who had been following her. The man she had since learned was called Reed, one of Harlan Cruz's most trusted men and one of the most dangerous individuals in the New Mexico territory. She had not known why Reed was following her instead of simply delivering another message. She had not known that Harlan Cruz had made a calculation, that Ada Keller, arriving alone with nothing but her nerve, was not worth bargaining with. She was worth eliminating. Because a dead Ada Keller could not testify to the land dispute, could not write letters to newspapers, could not become inconvenient. She learned all of this later. On the morning of September the 29th, she knew only that she was frightened, and that a stranger with dark eyes had asked her name before putting himself between her and the man who meant to kill her. His name was John Lawson. She found that out from the man who ran the general store, a thin, nervous individual named Mr. Peabody, who pulled her inside after the shot and stood with her behind the counter while John Lawson walked back up the street like a man returning from a morning stroll. "John Lawson, Mr. Peabody repeated when she asked. "You do not want to be in his debt, miss. I mean no disrespect to the man, but he is not the kind of person you want to owe favors to. His past has got teeth." Ada thought about the way he had said her name, the weight of it, the deliberateness. "Tell me what you know about him," she said. Mr. Peabody told her what most people in the territory knew, which was partly fact and partly the kind of story that grows up around a certain type of man, the way vines grow up around old fence posts, until you cannot tell where the wood ends and the plant begins. John Lawson had been a lawman once, a deputy marshal working under Judge Isaac Parker out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, in the late 1870s. He had been, by all accounts, exceptional at the work, methodical, unafraid, possessed of an uncanny ability to read a situation before it escalated. He had a reputation for taking men alive when possible, for following the law rather than substituting his own judgment for it, for being, in short, the kind of person who gave the office of deputy marshal whatever credibility it had managed to accumulate in a territory where the law was still a new and largely theoretical concept. What had ended that career was a matter of considerable disagreement depending on who you asked. Some said he had shot a man who did not deserve shooting, an accused killer who had already surrendered, and that the resulting inquiry had left his name and his standing in ruins. Others said the opposite, that he had refused to shoot a man who absolutely needed shooting, a political associate of someone important enough to have John Lawson removed from his position rather than let the truth come out. A third version, the one Mr. Peabody found most convincing, was that the entire situation had been manufactured by a network of corrupt officials who had been skimming money from territorial land sales, and who had identified John Lawson as the one man methodical enough and principled enough to eventually follow the paper trail back to them, and who had therefore arranged for his disgrace before he could do so. Whatever had actually happened, John Lawson had been discharged from service in 1879, and since then he had been what people in the territory delicately referred to as a hired resolution specialist, which was a polished way of saying he was available for work that required the specific skill set he had developed and had nowhere else to apply. "Is he dangerous?" Ada asked. Mr. Peabody looked at her like she had asked whether the sun was warm. "Terrifyingly so," he said. "But not to people who haven't earned it. That's the distinction, I suppose. That's what makes him a different variety of creature than the men who ride for Harlan Cruz. Ada folded her hands in her lap and thought about Thomas, sitting somewhere in the territory with a clock ticking over his head. She thought about Harlan Cruz and his dead-eyed enforcers. She thought about the way John Lawson had asked her name like it was the only thing that mattered in that moment. She thought, I have no other options. She found him at the saloon, which in Dusty Creek in 1882 was not the kind of establishment that inspired confidence. It was a building that had been constructed in a hurry and maintained not at all. A single rectangular room with a bar along one wall and a collection of mismatched tables and chairs, and a smell that combined wood smoke and spilled whiskey, and something unidentifiable that Ada decided not to investigate. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it held approximately a dozen men in varying states of alertness, and one woman behind the bar who looked at Ada with an expression that combined assessment and sympathy in roughly equal measure. John Lawson was at a table in the far corner, alone, with a glass of whiskey and a map that he was not particularly trying to hide. He looked up when she came in, and the dark eyes found her immediately, and he said nothing, which she took as permission to approach. She sat down across from him without being invited. "You know why I'm here," she said. "I know why you came to Dusty Creek," he said. "I don't know why you're sitting at my table. Because you put yourself between me and a man who meant to kill me this morning, and I need to know if that was accidental or deliberate." He was quiet for a moment. He had a face that was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because it was controlled, the kind of face that had learned to reveal exactly as much as it intended to and nothing more. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she estimated, with the kind of lean that comes from years of hard living rather than insufficient eating, and hands that were still and exact in the way that told you they were capable of extraordinary speed when the situation required it. "It was deliberate," he said. "Why?" He turned the glass on the table, slow revolution, thinking about something. "I've been watching Cruz's men for 2 weeks. The one you saw this morning, the one called Reed, I had separate reasons to remove him from the situation. Your presence changed the timing but not the outcome." He paused. "That's not the whole answer. What's the rest of it?" He looked at her directly for the first time, really looked, and something shifted in those dark eyes, a thing she could not name but that made her straighten slightly without knowing why. "You came here alone," he said. "A woman alone in this particular town at this particular moment is either very brave or very desperate, and you don't look like the kind of person who mistakes desperation for bravery. Which means you have a reason, and my experience says it probably involves Harlan Cruz, and anything that involves Harlan Cruz is something I'm presently interested in." Ada told him about Thomas. She had not intended to tell him everything, but the way he listened, completely still, giving the story his full attention without interruption, without the skeptical shifting and impatient refocusing that most men performed when a woman spoke at length, undid her careful plan to share only what was necessary. She told him about Abilene and the land and her cousin and the shooting and the messages and the deadline. She told him about her mother dying. She told him about a year of seamstress work and carefully counted coins and letters that came back unanswered or not at all. She told him all of it in a level voice, and when she was finished she sat back and waited for him to tell her what he thought she should do. He did not tell her what to do. That was the first unexpected thing. "What do you want?" he said instead. "I want my brother alive and out of Harlan Cruz's reach." "And after that?" she blinked. "What do you mean after that?" "I mean, what do you want for yourself?" He was watching her carefully, not unkindly. "Because what you're describing costs something. Anyone who helps you with this takes on a degree of risk, and risk has a price, and I need to understand whether what you're asking for is worth the price I'd be paying." She had not expected that either. She had expected him to name a dollar figure she could not meet, or to dismiss her entirely, or to listen politely and then do nothing. She had not expected him to ask her what she wanted for herself as though that were a relevant part of the equation. "I want a life," she said, and she was surprised by how raw it came out, how much it sounded like what it was, a confession. "I've been surviving for 2 years. I want to stop surviving and start living. I want Thomas safe, and then I want to find a place and build something that's mine. I want," she stopped herself, "I want things I have no business wanting given the circumstances." John Lawson studied her for a long moment. "The deadline is October the 1st, he said. "Yes. That's day after tomorrow." "Yes." He folded the map he'd been looking at. "I know where Cruz keeps men when he's conducting business in this county. I know the general structure of his operation, and I know certain specific vulnerabilities in it. I've been building a case in my own way for reasons that are separate from yours, and what you've told me fills in some pieces I was missing." He set the map to one side. "I can't promise your brother is alive or unharmed. I need you to understand that. I can promise that I will take you to him if he is alive, and I will do everything in my power to get him out." "Why?" she asked. "You said risk has a price. What are you asking for?" The corner of his mouth shifted, barely a movement, barely the suggestion of wry humor. "Information when this is over. You said your family had a legitimate claim to that land. I need documented testimony about what Cruz did, how he operated, who gave orders. If I can build that case properly and get it in front of the right federal authorities, it damages a network that's been operating in this territory for 6 years." He paused. "That's what I'm asking for." She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "All right," she said. What she had not anticipated was how quickly the practical arrangement of sharing information and pursuing a common goal would begin to feel like something else entirely. They spent the rest of September the 29th planning, and Ada discovered that John Lawson's mind was one of the most precisely organized things she had ever encountered. He thought in structures, in contingencies, in if-this-then, that chains of reasoning that anticipated failure at every point and built workarounds into the original plan without losing the plan's fundamental coherence. He drew diagrams. He asked questions that seemed tangential and turned out to be central. He listened to her thoughts without dismissing them, which continued to surprise her. At one point, she offered a suggestion about Thomas's likely location, based on something her brother had mentioned in a letter 18 months prior, a reference to a specific kind of escarpment visible from a certain elevation along the eastern slope of the Sacramento Mountains. And John Lawson went very still and then said, "Say that again," with an urgency that told her the detail had landed somewhere important in his mental map. She said it again. He matched it to something he knew, and the match produced a location, a specific canyon property that Cruz used as a remote holding location for exactly the kind of problem that Thomas represented. "How did you know to mention that?" he asked. "My brother described it in a letter," she said. "I memorized all his letters." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was its neighbor. "Why?" "Because I didn't know which detail would matter someday," she said. "My father taught me that. He said information is the only thing you can carry that doesn't weigh anything." John was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a practical man." "He was a German immigrant who built a ranch from nothing with no one to help him," she said. "He had to be practical. He didn't have the luxury of being anything else." Something moved in John's face then. Something that was not the controlled reveal of carefully rationed expression, but something that arrived before the control could catch it. It was only there for a second, but she saw it, and she filed it away with the same discipline her father had taught her about useful information. They left before dawn on September the 30th, which gave them a full day to reach the canyon before the deadline. John had a horse, a dark bay named November that moved like it had been bred for this specific territory, and he had arranged a second horse for Ada through the woman behind the bar at the saloon, whose name was Clara, and who turned out to be John's occasional source of local intelligence, a woman of considerable practical knowledge, and a past she did not discuss, but that had clearly involved enough proximity to danger to make her an excellent judge of it. Clara had looked at Ada before they left with the same expression she'd worn when Ada first walked into the saloon, assessment, and sympathy. But now there was something added to it, a watchfulness that felt almost protective. "Keep your eyes on him," Clara said quietly while John was checking the horses. "Not because he'll mislead you, because he'll take everything on himself if you let him. He's been doing this alone too long. He's forgotten how to let someone stand beside him." Ada thought about that as they rode out into the pre-dawn darkness, the New Mexico territory spreading out around them in the particular blue-black of that hour, the Sacramento mountains a jagged silhouette against a sky still full of stars. She thought about a man who had built a system of contingencies for every possible failure, who had planned alone for 2 weeks, who had asked her what she wanted for herself before asking anything else. She thought about secrets and hidden motives and the kind of dark past that Mr. Peabody had described with such careful delicacy. She rode up beside him. "Tell me what actually happened," she said. "With your discharge, the real version." He rode for a while without answering, and she thought he was going to decline, and she was already composing the mental note to not ask again when he said, "How much do you know?" "Mr. Peabody gave me 3 versions." "Which one did he think was true?" "The third one, the political one, the network of corrupt officials." John nodded slowly, watching the path ahead. "That one is closest, though it leaves out some details." "What details?" Another long pause. "There was a woman involved, not romantically, a witness. She had seen the land transaction documents, the real ones, the ones that showed what Cruz's associates were doing to the federal land allocation process. She was willing to testify. I was supposed to escort her to Fort Smith." He stopped. "She didn't make it." The weight of that hung in the cool morning air between them. "Cruz's people?" Ada asked. "Someone's people," he said. "I never fully established whose." That failure, not being able to establish it, not being able to bring charges, that's the part that lives in me the most. Not what they did to my career, what they did to her, because I didn't anticipate the specific threat. "How old were you?" 27. Ada calculated. He was 31 or 32 now. 4 years carrying that. She thought about 2 years of carrying Thomas's situation alone, the seamstress work and the careful coins and the letters, and she thought, "He has been carrying something heavier than mine for longer than I have." "That's why you're still here," she said, "building the case. You've been building it since then." "Yes. And you'll keep building it until you can finish it." He looked at her then briefly, the dark eyes finding her face in the growing gray light of approaching dawn. "Or until it finishes me," he said, and it was not self-pity, only honesty, and the honesty of it was more unsettling than self-pity would have been. "It's not going to finish you," she said, with a certainty that surprised her and apparently surprised him as well, because he looked at her again, and this time the look lasted longer. "You sound very sure of that," he said. "I am," she said, "because you're too careful to let it." They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before, a silence that had been cleared of something, opened up. The stars faded and the sky went from black to deep blue to the washed-out gray of early morning, and the mountains resolved out of their silhouette into actual stone and scrub and shadow, and Ada found herself watching John Lawson's profile against that changing sky and thinking thoughts she had not expected to be thinking. She had not come to Dusty Creek looking for anyone. She had come looking for her brother and a way out of the particular corner she had been backed into, and she had not had the luxury of thinking beyond those 2 things. She had not had the luxury of noticing a man's profile against a morning sky, or the way he held his body in the saddle, or the particular quality of attention he brought to the world around him that made you feel, inexplicably, like things were going to be all right. She reminded herself, Thomas first, everything else after. They reached the canyon by mid-afternoon. John had spent the last hour of the ride explaining the approach in the same way he explained everything, carefully, with contingencies. There would be at least 2 men guarding whatever location Cruz was using, possibly 4. He needed to get in close enough to confirm Thomas's presence before making any move, because if Thomas was not there, the plan changed entirely. Ada was to stay at the tree line until he signaled. She agreed, because agreeing was the tactically correct choice, and because she trusted his judgment in this specific domain in a way that she trusted very few people's judgment about anything. What she had not agreed to was staying at the tree line. Once she confirmed that the voice she heard from inside the crude, wooden structure at the base of the canyon was Thomas's. It was unmistakably his, a voice she had listened to her whole life, currently engaged in what sounded like an argument about food, which was so entirely characteristic of her brother that she almost laughed out loud at the worst possible moment. She moved forward. John saw her do it. She could tell from the way his whole body went briefly rigid with the specific frustration of someone whose careful plan is being altered by an unpredictable variable. He could not call to her without alerting the guards. He could only recalculate. She got within 20 feet of the door before one of the guards rounded the corner of the structure and saw her. The next 30 seconds were what her mind would later describe, when she had the luxury of reviewing them, as a very educational experience in the speed at which John Lawson can move when motivated. The guard had his rifle up and was opening his mouth to shout when John came around the far side of the structure, and the situation resolved itself with a quiet efficiency that Ada found both reassuring and slightly frightening. 2 guards, one on each side, and John had apparently anticipated the patrol pattern so precisely that he had positioned himself to deal with both of them in sequence, without giving either one time to discharge a weapon or raise an alarm. It was not what she would call violent in the way that she had feared violence might be. It was controlled and exact, like watching a man solve a mechanical problem he had solved many times before. The door to the structure came open from the inside while John was securing the second guard, and Thomas Keller stood in the frame, blinking, looking exactly like the younger version of their father that Ada had been carrying in her memory for 2 years, only thinner and considerably more startled. "Ada," he said. "What in the not now?" she said, and crossed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him so hard he made a sound that was half protest and half relief. She heard John come up behind her and say quietly, "We need to move. The second set of guards changes in about 40 minutes. Thomas looked over her shoulder at John with the wary, assessing look of a young man who has learned the hard way to be suspicious of unfamiliar people operating with apparent authority. "Who is that?" Thomas asked. "He's the reason you're leaving here alive," Ada said. Thomas looked at John for another moment and then said, with the particular pragmatic economy of someone who has lived through enough difficulty to know when to ask questions and when to simply accept assistance, "All right. Where are we going?" They went back to Dusty Creek, which required riding hard for 3 hours with the awareness that once the second set of guards arrived at the canyon and found the situation, a search would begin. John set a pace that was demanding but not cruel, and he kept Ada and Thomas between himself and the direction he judged any pursuit would come from. And when they finally rode into Dusty Creek in the blue darkness of early evening, he went directly to Clara's and arranged for Thomas to have a room and a hot meal, and the particular anonymity that Clara was apparently practiced at providing. Ada sat across the table from her brother and watched him eat and thought about how far they had both come from Abilene and the 70 acres, and their father's careful hands and their mother's quiet fierceness, and she felt something in her chest that was grief and relief and love all wound together in a knot too complicated to separate. Thomas ate, and then he talked, and what he told her about the last 2 years was difficult to hear and necessary to hear in equal measure. He had run with dangerous people, because dangerous people were the only ones who had offered him shelter. He had done things he was not proud of, nothing that crossed the line he had privately drawn for himself, but enough to know that the line existed and that he had been standing close to it for a long time. He was 21 years old and he looked like he was 30. "I need to leave this territory," he said. "Not just Dusty Creek, the whole territory." "California," Ada said. "California," he agreed. "Or Oregon, somewhere far enough that Harlan Cruz isn't a name anyone knows." Ada nodded. "We'll figure out the money." Thomas shook his head. Not we. You don't have to come with me. You don't have to give up whatever you're building here just because I need to run." She opened her mouth to say that she was not building anything here, that she had arrived 4 days ago with nothing, and she had nothing now, and there was nothing to leave. But the words stopped themselves somewhere in her throat, because she was thinking, without meaning to, about John Lawson, about a man who had been building a case alone for 4 years because he had not had anyone to stand beside him, about dark eyes and a controlled face, and the moment he had turned back from a completed duel to say her name like he had been keeping it for something. She said, "Get some rest, Thomas. We'll talk about it tomorrow." She found John Lawson on the small porch at the back of the saloon, which faced away from the main street and looked out toward the dark shape of the mountains, the same mountains they had ridden through that day. He was standing with his arms crossed and a cup of coffee that Clara must have provided, looking at nothing or looking at everything. It was hard to tell the difference with him. Ada came and stood beside him, not at a conversational distance but close enough that the warmth of him was a presence against the cool of the evening, and she said nothing for a while because he had not spoken and because she had learned in the course of one very long and eventful day that John Lawson appreciated the space to be quiet. Eventually he said, "Your brother is all right." "I know," she said. "Thank you." He turned his head and looked at her sideways, a brief check. "You moved up before I signaled." "I heard his voice," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. "You're lucky it worked out." "I knew it would," she said, "because of you." Another pause. The mountains were invisible now, just a solid absence against the stars. Somewhere down the street a dog barked once and stopped. "I need the testimony," he said. "The documented account of the land situation. Your family's claim, the dispute, what Cruz's men did. Thomas will need to give a statement as well, and he needs to agree to have it delivered to the Federal Land Office in Santa Fe along with the other materials I've compiled." "He'll do it," Ada said. "I'll make sure he does it." "It won't be enough on its own," John said. "I've been building toward a federal investigation for 4 years, and what you've brought me completes one piece of it, an important piece, but there are other pieces. It will take more time." "How much more time?" "Months, maybe longer. Harlan Cruz has friends in the territorial government, and dismantling that kind of protection is slow work. It requires more than evidence. It requires finding the right people in the right offices and presenting the case in a way that makes it impossible to bury." Ada listened to him lay this out, the same methodical structure she had observed in him all day, the contingency building, the realistic assessment of obstacles. She listened, and she thought about Thomas needing to leave and about Clara's words that morning about a man who had been doing this alone too long, and about her father's voice in her memory saying that information is the only thing you can carry that doesn't weigh anything. "John," she said. He looked at her fully this time, turning to face her, and the lamplight from the saloon's back window caught the planes of his face and made him look, for just a moment, less controlled and more human. "What Clara said this morning," she said, "about you doing this alone." "Clara talks too much," he said without heat. "She's right, though." Ada kept her eyes on his. "You've been carrying this case and this plan and this," she searched for the word, "this obligation alone for 4 years. And I don't know the whole story and I'm not pretending I do. But you asked me this morning what I wanted and I told you, and now I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you want? When the case is built and the testimony is delivered and Harlan Cruz is dismantled, what do you want after that?" He was silent for a long time. The kind of silence she had come to recognize as actual consideration rather than deflection. "I don't know," he said finally, and it came out rough, unpolished, like something he had not said aloud before. "I've been thinking about this one thing for so long that I haven't," he stopped. "Haven't thought past it," she said. "No." She looked at him and thought about what it was to live inside a single purpose for 4 years, to build your whole existence around one obligation, to let everything else go unexamined because examining it would require allowing that there was a life beyond the purpose, and that was too frightening or too painful or both. "Well," she said carefully, "I'm going to be here for a while." helping Thomas get ready to travel, arranging the statements, whatever you need for the case. I'm here. And if you decide at some point that you'd like company while you figure out what comes next, I'm also here for that." John Lawson stared at her. It was the first time she had seen his control genuinely fail. It was not a large failure, not a dramatic one, not anything that someone less attentive would have noticed. But she noticed. The slight widening of those dark eyes, the fractional part of the lips, the moment before the training reasserted itself. "Ada," he said, and her name in his mouth again had that quality, that weight. "You don't have to answer tonight," she said. "It was just an observation." And she went inside, leaving him with the dark mountains and the cooling air, and whatever he was going to do with what she had said. The next 2 weeks in Dusty Creek were the most unexpected 2 weeks of Ada Keller's life. She had expected to be preparing Thomas for departure and producing documentation and waiting anxiously for some response from Harlan Cruz, some retaliation for the removal of Thomas from that canyon. She had expected fear and urgency and possibly another encounter with Cruz's men. She had expected to be useful in a crisis management sort of way, and then to face the question of what came next with no particular answer. What she had not expected was a slow, careful, entirely voluntary unfolding. John came to find her the morning after she had left him on the porch. He came to the room that Clara had given her, knocked with the specific courtesy of a man who has thought carefully about the social implications of knocking on a woman's door, and said through the wood that he needed her help with the documentation and would she be available. She was available. They worked at the saloon's back table, away from the other customers, with the ledgers and letters and land documents that John had been accumulating for 4 years spread out between them. He walked her through the structure of the case, explaining what each piece meant and where it fit, and she listened and began to understand the scope of what he had been building. Not just an accusation against Harlan Cruz, but a comprehensive dismantling of a corruption network that extended from local land offices all the way to certain appointed positions in the territorial government, a network that had been skimming federal land allocation money, manipulating grazing rights, falsifying survey records, and eliminating witnesses for the better part of a decade. The witness who had died in 1879 was named Ellen Marsh. She had been a land office clerk who had recognized the discrepancies in the allocation records and made the mistake of mentioning it to someone she thought she could trust. She had been 24 years old. Ada asked about her only once, directly, and John answered directly, and then they sat with the weight of it for a moment before returning to the documents, and it was in that moment, in the shared willingness to sit with something difficult and then return to the work, that Ada felt something solidify between them that had previously been only possibility. Thomas proved to be more resilient than he looked when he was eating Clara's food and sleeping in an actual bed. Within a week he was up and useful and deeply, sincerely remorseful about what his situation had cost Ada, and about the 2 years she had spent managing the consequences of his choices. He told her this with the directness of someone who has had a great deal of enforced time to think, and she received it with the combination of love and pragmatism that had always characterized their relationship. "You're not coming to California," he said one afternoon, watching her at the back table with John. It was not a question. Ada looked up from the document she was reading. "We haven't decided anything." "You haven't decided anything," Thomas said. "That man decided something the morning he asked your name." She felt heat climb her neck. "Thomas, I'm not criticizing it," he said. "I'm just observing, same as Father used to observe things." He was quiet for a moment. He'd have liked him. Father would have liked John Lawson. Ada said nothing. She looked back at the document and thought about her father's hands and his practical wisdom, and the 70 acres he had built from nothing. And she thought about John Lawson building a case from nothing with no one to stand beside him. And she thought that Thomas, who had always been more perceptive than his fire sometimes suggested, was probably right. John found small reasons to be near her. She noticed this with the part of her mind that noticed patterns, the same part that had memorized Thomas's letters for the useful detail they might one day contain. He found reasons, a question about the documentation, a second opinion on a piece of evidence, a meal at the same table, a suggestion that the evening air was good for thinking, and would she care for company on a short walk. She always said yes. The walks were where the real conversations happened. Away from the saloon and Clara's watchful, warmly conspiratorial presence, away from the documents and the structured work. In the brief desert evenings when the light turned the dry hills gold, and the air smelled of sage and the distant possibility of rain. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher and a carpenter, both of them now dead, both of them people who had apparently invested heavily in the notion that understanding the world you lived in was both a duty and a form of respect. He told her about the law training, the marshal's service, the years when the work had felt like a calling rather than an obligation. He told her about the moment it changed, not the political machinery but the actual moment, standing in a room in Fort Smith with a letter in his hand, and the knowledge that he had failed someone who had trusted him to see the danger before it arrived, and the particular silence that follows that kind of knowledge. "You didn't fail her," Ada said. They were walking along the edge of the town where the streets dissolved into open ground, the mountains purple in the evening light. "You failed to prevent what someone else chose to do to her. Those are different things." He walked in silence for a moment. "The rational part of me knows that," he said. "Then argue with the irrational part," she said. "Tell it what you know. You've been letting the irrational part set the terms for 4 years. He stopped walking. She walked 2 more steps and then stopped as well and turned to face him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, a looking at something he hadn't expected to find expression, open and carefully astonished. "You are extremely direct," he said. "My mother was direct," she said. "My father called it her German inheritance. I call it a preference for clarity. I've noticed," he said. "I find it," he stopped, as though deciding whether to finish the sentence. "You find it what?" she said. "Necessary," he said. "It turns out, in a way I didn't know I was missing." The gold in the hills was deepening to amber. The shadows were long and pointed, and the air had the particular charged quality that sometimes came before a change in weather. Ada looked at John Lawson standing in that light with his carefully controlled face gone briefly unguarded, and she thought, "This is a man who has been waiting for something he had given up expecting to find." She took the 2 steps back to close the distance between them. "John," she said quietly, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said, in the same careful, braced way he said things when he suspected they were going to matter. "I came to Dusty Creek because I had no choice," she said. "I stayed because of Thomas. I kept working with you because of the case." She looked up at him. "And I would still be here even if Thomas had left yesterday and the case didn't need me at all." The silence between them was the kind that has a texture to it, a weight, a shape. John looked at her for a long moment, and she watched the careful architecture of his control dismantle itself quietly and voluntarily, watched him decide to let it. "I asked your name," he said, "before that duel." "I remember," she said. "I don't entirely know why," he said. "I've thought about it. The operational explanation is that I wanted you to speak so I could gauge where you were standing without moving my eyes off Reed. But that's not the whole truth." "What's the rest of it?" she asked, echoing his own question from their first conversation. "I wanted to know who I was doing it for," he said. "Before I did it, I wanted to know." Ada reached out and put her hand against the side of his face, the simplest possible gesture, and felt him become very still in the way that things become still when they are certain rather than frozen. "Ada Keller," she said softly. "That was the answer." He put his hand over hers where it rested against his face, and when he lowered his head and touched his lips to her forehead in the most deliberate and tender gesture she had ever received from anyone, she understood what Clara had meant. He did not do things carelessly. He did not do anything carelessly, and being on the receiving end of that level of careful intentionality was different from anything she had experienced before. They stood there in the amber light while the shadows lengthened, her hand warm against his face and his hand warm over hers, and it was exactly the right amount of time. The following weeks brought the inevitable consequence of two people deciding simultaneously to stop being careful with each other while remaining careful with the world. The distinction, Ada discovered, was crucial. In everything practical, the case, the documentation, the ongoing threat of Cruz's response, John remained as methodical and precise as ever. But in everything personal he became, in degrees so gradual they were almost imperceptible, less guarded. He found more reasons to sit beside her. He put his hand briefly at her back when they navigated the crowded saloon. He asked her opinion on things that had nothing to do with the case, on ideas and observations and the nature of the territory they were in, and he listened to her answers with the full, complete attention that she had first noticed, and that still, after weeks of it, made her feel like the most important person in the room. Thomas watched all of this with the quiet approval of someone who had made a decision and was content to see it play out. He spent his days working on his statement for the federal case, which was thorough and painful and necessary, and his evenings helping Clara around the saloon, which Clara accepted with cheerful pragmatism, and which seemed to give Thomas a sense of useful purpose that he badly needed. In the middle of October, 3 things happened in rapid succession that changed the shape of everything. The first was a message from Santa Fe. A federal land office investigator named Morrison, whom John had been corresponding with for over a year, had received enough of the accumulated documentation to formally open an inquiry into territorial land allocation irregularities. This was not a conviction and it was not a guarantee, but it was the official beginning of the end for Harlan Cruz's network, and John received the message in silence and then sat with his hands flat on the table for a long time, not moving, and Ada recognized what she was looking at, 4 years of effort becoming real. She did not say anything. She just put her hand over his on the table, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and that was enough. The second thing was a visit from Harlan Cruz himself. Ada had not expected it. She had expected more men like Reed, more distant pressure, more anonymous threat. She had not expected the man to walk into the saloon at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, with 2 men behind him, and the kind of proprietorial ease that comes from decades of having most things go the way you wanted them to. Harlan Cruz was in his late 50s, heavyset, with a face that had once been handsome, and had since become something that resembled authority without earning it. He dressed expensively for the territory, well-fitted coat and clean boots, and he wore his ownership of the room with the same unself-consciousness that some men wore their height. He sat down across from John without being invited, which Ada noticed was the same thing she had done the first day, and she thought, the comparison is not flattering to Cruz. "Lawson," Cruz said, "I heard you'd been busy." Investigator Morrison apparently thought so too, John said. Something moved in Cruz's face. He looked at Ada with an assessing flatness. "Miss Keller, you're a long way from Abilene." "Kansas has nothing left for me," she said. He studied her for another moment and then returned to John. "You understand that an inquiry is not a conviction." "I understand that," John said. "I also understand that an inquiry, if conducted properly, tends to produce convictions. Which is why the documentation I've been building was designed to survive the kind of interference that usually prevents proper conduct." Cruz was quiet. Ada could see him calculating, the way men do when they realize the board has shifted and they are trying to find the position that recovers the most. "The girl's brother is gone," Cruz said. "You know that? Left the territory." "I helped him leave," John said. "His statement was notarized before he went." Another calculation. "The land dispute," Cruz said. "The Keller claim. That was managed by people who are no longer in my employ, people who made decisions I did not personally authorize." "I'm sure your lawyer will make that argument," John said. "Investigator Morrison's office will be interested to evaluate it." Harlan Cruz sat back in his chair, and looked at John Lawson for a long moment with the specific expression of a man reassessing a situation he had previously misclassified. Then he looked at Ada again, and something in that look made her think that whatever calculations he had arrived at, he had decided that the balance had shifted beyond his ability to recover it by force or pressure in this specific moment. He stood up. "Lawson," he said, in a tone that was the verbal equivalent of a retreat that's trying to look like a choice. He did not look at Ada again. He left. John looked at the door for a moment and then looked at Ada. "That's what defeat looks like on a man like that," he said. "He won't accept it yet, but he knows." "How long until the inquiry produces results?" she asked. "Months," he said. "But the meaningful threat to you and Thomas is gone. He's not going to add to his legal exposure by targeting civilians when he's already under federal inquiry." Ada felt something release in her chest that had been tightly wounded since she had opened that first threatening message in Abilene. Not entirely released. She would not feel entirely released until the inquiry reached its conclusion, but enough. Enough to breathe differently. Enough to look at the future with something other than the management of crisis. The third thing that happened in October was that John Lawson asked her a question that was not about the case. They were on the evening walk, the one that had become a daily ritual she could not imagine doing without, and the light was the particular autumn gold that made the New Mexico territory look like something a painter had composed too dramatically for anyone to believe. The mountains were sharp against a sky going peach at the horizon, and the sage smelled like everything good that the territory had to offer, and Ada was talking about something she had read in a newspaper that Clara kept around the saloon, something about the federal land policies and how the recent inquiry connected to broader patterns in territorial governance, and John was listening with that full attention, and then he said, "Ada." She stopped talking. The tone was different. "Yes," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped as well. He was looking at the mountains for a moment, gathering something, and then he turned to face her with the expression that she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was about to say something he had prepared and was about to depart from the prepared version because the prepared version was not sufficient. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, about what you want, the life you described, somewhere to build something of your own." "I remember," she said. "I've been thinking about it in relation to certain other things," he said, with the slightly stiff phrasing of a man working very hard to say something that does not fit naturally into his usual mode of communication. "About the case and what comes after it. About this territory and whether it's where I want to be when this is done, or whether what I want might be somewhere else. About—" He stopped. "About what?" she said gently. "About whether the thing I've been looking for, the reason to build something, might already be present, and whether I have done anything to deserve the consideration of whether that might be so." Ada looked at him standing in the autumn gold light, this man with his dark eyes and his controlled face and his 4 years of carried obligation and his careful, complete attention, and she felt something in her expand like a flower that has been waiting for a specific quality of warmth. "John Lawson," she said, "are you trying to ask me something?" "Badly," he admitted. "Ask it properly," she said. He took a breath. He looked at her directly. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not for the case, not for Thomas, not for any reason that has an expiration date. Will you stay because—" The preparation abandoned him entirely, and what came out was unfiltered and real and exactly right. "Because I have been alone in this for so long that I forgot what it felt like to have something to come back to at the end of the day, and I would very much not like to forget that again, now that I know." Ada reached up and put her hand against his face the way she had weeks ago, the same simple gesture, and this time she felt him lean into it rather than become still. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." He kissed her then, finally, properly, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered to him, and the sage smelled golden and the mountains turned peach and rose in the dying light, and neither of them was thinking about the case or the territory or Harlan Cruz or any of the specific difficulties that had brought them to this exact point in this exact field. They were only thinking about this. The months that followed were the months of building. Ada was good at building. She had watched her father do it, literal and figurative, from a child's clear-eyed distance that records everything without filtering it through adult complication. She knew how to be patient with the slow parts and energetic with the parts that required energy. She knew how to plan for contingency without losing sight of the primary goal. She knew how to sit beside someone on a long project and not make that person feel crowded. It turned out that John Lawson had a corresponding talent. He knew how to be present in the parts that required presence and absent in the parts that required solitude. He knew how to read a situation accurately before acting on it. He knew how to care for something without the caring becoming a kind of control. They were good together in the specific way that two people are good together when their differences are complementary rather than combative. Ada brought directness and warmth, and a gift for seeing the human dimension of things that John, for all his intelligence, sometimes allowed his structure building to obscure. John brought patience and precision, and a kind of steadiness that Ada, who had been doing everything alone for years, had not known she needed until it was present. Clara watched all of this with the satisfaction of someone who had provided the correct stage and the correct lighting, and is now enjoying the play that resulted. She also, on one occasion that Ada found both touching and slightly embarrassing, told John Lawson directly that if he managed to let Ada Keller leave Dusty Creek without properly settling the question, she would consider it a personal failure on his part and deal with it accordingly. She already said she'd stay, John had told her, with the tone of a man who is reporting a relevant fact. Staying is not the same as settled, Clara had said. John had apparently given this serious consideration, because 2 weeks later he presented Ada with her mother's silver brooch, which she had entrusted to Clara for safekeeping when she first arrived in Dusty Creek with no knowledge of what her situation might require. He had gone to Clara and retrieved it and had a small addition made to it by the silversmith 2 towns over, a simple setting beside the original that held a small garnet, dark red, the color of the hills in the late afternoon light. "I know it's not a conventional proposal," he said. She looked at the brooch in her palm, her mother's silver and his addition, the old and the new together. "My mother would have liked it," she said. "Is that a yes?" he asked, with a directness that she recognized as borrowed from her own vocabulary, and she loved him for it. "John Lawson," she said, "that is an absolutely unconditional yes." They were married in November 1882 in Dusty Creek, which was not a particularly romantic venue for a wedding but which was the place where everything had started, and which therefore had the specific significance of the real over the picturesque. Clara provided the meal. Mr. Peabody, who had substantially revised his initial cautionary assessment of John Lawson, provided the flowers, a consideration that moved Ada more than she expected. The justice of the peace was a stout, cheerful man named Grover, who seemed genuinely delighted to have a wedding to conduct rather than the various property disputes and domestic arguments that constituted most of his workload. Thomas was not there. He had sent a letter from Oregon that arrived 3 days before the ceremony, full of the particular inarticulate warmth that Thomas expressed when the emotion was too large for his usual vocabulary. He was doing well. He had found work on a ranch near a small town outside of Portland. He was, for the first time in years, something that resembled safe and something that resembled settled. He sent his love to Ada and his respect to John and a message that said, in its entirety, "Ada, you told me you wanted a life. I hope this is the beginning of it." She kept the letter. The federal inquiry concluded in March of 1883. It concluded not with the dramatic courtroom confrontation of fiction, but with the methodical administrative machinery of actual federal process, the collection of evidence, the issuance of charges, the legal proceedings that move through the territorial court system with the grinding, unstoppable efficiency of a large stone wheel. Harlan Cruz was formally charged with 17 counts relating to land fraud, falsification of federal documents, and conspiracy. Several of his associates in the territorial government were similarly charged. The proceedings took months, as John had always said they would. When the verdict came, Ada was washing dishes in the small house they had built on the edge of Dusty Creek, a house that was not large but was well constructed and thoughtfully designed, and that bore John's particular talent for careful structure in every joint and beam. And John came in through the door with a telegram in his hand, and he sat down at the table and he looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at her. "It's done," he said. She dried her hands and went to him, and he stood to meet her, and she put her arms around him, and he held her with the specific quality of someone releasing something they have been holding for a very long time. She felt him breathe. They did not need to speak for a while. The verdict was real and the obligation was completed, and Ellen Marsh had her accounting, 4 years late and imperfect, and the only kind of justice the human world produces, which is partial and slow and better than nothing. They stood in the kitchen of the house they had built together, and they held on to each other, and when he finally spoke his voice was rough but steady. "Your father was right," he said. "Information doesn't weigh anything, but justice," he stopped. "Justice weighs everything," she finished. "Until it's delivered." He held her tighter. "Yes," he said, "until it's delivered." Spring came to the New Mexico territory the way it always did, with a sudden vehemence that had nothing subtle about it, the hills greening overnight, the air going warm, the arroyo running with the snowmelt from the mountains. Ada planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, the way her mother had always planted one, practical rows of things that could be eaten, supplemented by the kind of flowers that Miriam Keller had always maintained were not a luxury, but a form of evidence that life was worth attending to carefully. She thought about her mother often in those spring weeks. Thought about the quiet fierceness and the decision to sell the land and move south toward a life that had turned out harder than promised and shorter than it should have been. She thought about what her mother would have made of John Lawson, of this house, of the kitchen garden and the silver brooch with the garnet. She thought her mother would have been satisfied. Not effusively pleased, that not being Miriam Keller's style, but satisfied. The particular satisfaction of someone who has wanted a specific good thing for someone they love and has lived to see it arrive. She thought about this one afternoon while she was planting beans, and then she stopped thinking and just sat for a moment in the warm spring dirt and let herself feel it. The good thing. The actual, present, undeniable good thing. The life she had told John she wanted. The building of something that was hers, theirs. John came looking for her in the garden when she did not come in for supper, which was how she discovered that she had been sitting in the dirt thinking about her mother for considerably longer than she had realized. He crouched beside her with a patient, slightly concerned expression and said, "Ada, are you all right?" She looked at him in the late afternoon light, the light that she had come to think of as his light, the gold amber that showed him most clearly. "I'm perfect," she said. He believed her, because he had learned to read her the way she had learned to read him, and he could tell the difference between sadness and something that looked like sadness, but was actually a form of fullness. He held out his hand. She took it, and he helped her up from the garden, and they walked back inside together, and she told him about thinking about her mother, and he listened in the way that made her feel like everything she said was worth saying. In the autumn of 1883, they found out Ada was expecting. She told him on an evening walk, the same evening walk, the one that had been the location of so many important conversations, that they had both come to think of the particular stretch of ground at the edge of Dusty Creek as their own private diplomatic territory where difficult and wonderful things were established. He went very still when she told him, and then he turned to face her, and the expression on his face was unlike any she had seen from him before, wide open and undefended and luminous, in a way that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Ada," he said. "I know," she said. He took both her hands in his and held them, looking at her, and she could see him thinking through everything the way he always thought through everything, the contingencies and the structure and the what comes next, and then he smiled. And it was the fullest smile she had ever seen from him, the one that took his whole face. "A Lawson," he said, a little stunned. "A Keller Lawson," she corrected. He laughed. Actually laughed, the real one that she had learned to draw out of him because it required a particular combination of the unexpected and the joyful that he could not always locate on his own. She loved his laugh. She had worked for every instance of it. "A Keller Lawson," he agreed. They wrote to Thomas together that night, the letter going to Oregon with the news, and Ada imagined her brother in his small town outside Portland reading it with the same inarticulate warmth he had sent to her. Their son was born in May of 1884, delivered with the assistance of the doctor who had come to Dusty Creek the previous year when the town had finally grown enough to warrant permanent medical care. It was a long labor and an anxious one, and John spent it in a state of controlled agitation that Clara, who refused to leave under any circumstances, found more entertaining than she probably should have, and that Ada, between contractions, found deeply endearing. They named him Heinrich after Ada's father. It seemed right. A name that meant something, that connected the new life to the lives that had made it possible. Heinrich Keller Lawson was, from his first hours, an observant and opinionated individual who appeared to have inherited his father's stillness and his mother's directness in measures that, even at the beginning, suggested a personality that was going to require a great deal of patient engagement. He looked at the world with those same dark eyes that Ada had first seen on the street outside the general store, and she thought every time she looked at him, "That is your father's way of watching things, that exact quality of attention." John held his son with the same deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered to him, and Ada, watching from the bed where she was recovering, thought, "This is the image she would carry longest. This one." The man who had asked her name before a duel, standing in the lamplight of their house in Dusty Creek, holding the child who had his eyes. Clara came to see Heinrich the day after the birth, and declared him the finest Dusty Creek production since the town's establishment, and gifted him with a blanket she had apparently been making in secret for 3 months. She hugged Ada with the particular fierceness of a woman who does not hug often, but means it absolutely when she does. "I told you," Clara said quietly. "What did you tell me?" Ada said. "That he'd taken everything on himself too long," Clara said. "Look at him now." Ada looked. John was showing Heinrich the view from the window, describing the mountains in the careful, specific way he described things he wanted someone to understand properly, and Heinrich was, insofar as a 2-day-old infant is capable of anything, apparently listening. "I see him," Ada said. The months after Heinrich's birth were full in the way that life becomes full when it has been built correctly. There were difficult days, as there always are. The territory was still the territory. Dusty Creek was still a frontier town with all the roughness and unpredictability that implied. And the life they were building required constant maintenance of the kind that is exhausting and worthwhile in equal measure. John took a position as a legal consultant to the Federal Land Office in Santa Fe, a job that drew on exactly the skills he had spent 4 years applying informally, and that required him to travel occasionally but not constantly, and that gave him, for the first time since Fort Smith, the feeling of doing legitimate work within a structure he could trust. Ada, whose gift for documentation and careful information management had proven genuinely useful during the case, began helping Dusty Creek's small but growing community with exactly the kind of practical literacy and organizational work that a frontier town perpetually needed. Recording land claims properly, drafting correspondence, maintaining records that would survive the various informal arrangements that tended to dissolve when circumstances changed and produce arguments that the law would then have to untangle. It was not glamorous work. It was entirely necessary work, the kind that makes actual civilization possible, and she was good at it in a way that made her father's voice in her memory say, "See, information, the thing you carry that doesn't weigh anything." Thomas came to visit in the summer of 1885. He arrived with 2 weeks' notice, a considerably fuller face, and a young woman named Margaret whose last name was O'Brien, and who had met Thomas through the ranch where he worked, and who had, in the year they had been keeping company, apparently become the specific and irreplaceable thing that Thomas had needed to become the best version of himself. She was bright-eyed and forthright, and seemed entirely unbothered by the complicated history that came with Thomas Keller, having apparently decided that a man who had been honest about his past and demonstrably committed to building a different future was worth the investment. Ada loved her immediately. Thomas and Margaret stayed for 3 weeks, and Ada watched her brother play with Heinrich and talk with John and eat Clara's food and sit on the porch of their house in the evenings with his arm around Margaret's shoulders, and she thought, Abilene is a long time ago. Mother, look, Abilene is a long time ago. On Thomas's last evening, Ada walked with him alone for the first time, just the two of them, the way they had walked sometimes as children when the ranch was quiet and the Kansas sky was enormous overhead. "You're happy," Thomas said, not a question. "Profoundly," she said. "Unexpectedly, are you?" "Getting there," he said. "Margaret helps." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent a long time being something Father would have been ashamed of, I know that. But I also think he searched for it. I think he would look at this and think it came right in the end." "It came right," Ada said. Thomas looked at her sideways, the young version of their father's face in his 30-year-old face. "You know what I remember most about the morning you left Abilene to come here?" "What?" "You didn't look frightened," he said, "even though you had every reason to be frightened. You looked like someone who had decided something." Ada thought about the woman who had climbed onto a horse with a coin purse and a dead mother's determination and headed south toward an uncertain danger, having decided nothing more complex than, "I will not lose what is left." "I had decided," she said. "I just hadn't decided the right thing yet. That came later," Thomas smiled. "A man with dark eyes on a dusty street. A man who asked my name," she said, "before he did something dangerous, like it mattered." "Like I mattered." "You did matter," Thomas said. "You always mattered. You just needed someone to say it out loud." She took his arm as they walked back toward the lights of the house, and she thought about all the specific steps that had led from there to here, the decision to leave, the road south, the morning in Dusty Creek with Reed across the street and a stranger's voice asking for her name, the table in the saloon, the canyon and Thomas's voice from inside the door, the maps and the documents and the evening walks in the gold light, the brooch with the garnet, the verdict in March, the kitchen garden, Heinrich's dark eyes. Every step had felt, in the moment, like only the next necessary thing. Looking back, it looked like inevitability, the kind that only reveals itself in retrospect. She had told John once, on an evening walk, that she thought the story of their life together had the shape of something that was always going to happen. He had looked at her with the particular skeptical precision of a man who prefers evidence to theory, and said that he was not certain he believed in inevitability. "Then believe in the facts," she had said. "The fact is that you asked my name. The fact is that I told you. The fact is that here we are." He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "Ada Keller Lawson." The same weight, the same deliberateness. "Yes," she had said. "I am very glad I asked," he had said. In the autumn of 1886, Ada found out she was expecting again. She told John in the garden this time, which by then had expanded considerably and produced enough vegetables to justify being called an actual enterprise rather than a domestic project. He was helping her with the late harvest, his sleeves rolled up against the warm afternoon, and she said his name in the tone that he had learned to recognize as the one that preceded something significant. He looked up. "Again," he said, and then corrected himself immediately. "I mean," but she was already laughing. "Again," she said. He crossed the garden in 4 steps and took her face in his hands with the same unhurried deliberateness he had always brought to the things that mattered most to him, and he kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then her forehead again, which was the specific sequence she had come to associate with the moments when he was fullest. "Keller Lawson or Lawson Keller this time?" he asked against her hair. "This time," she said, "we'll see who they turn out to be first." Their daughter was born in the spring of 1887, and they named her Miriam, because there was only one name that was right, and they both knew it without having to discuss it long. Miriam Keller Lawson entered the world with her mother's directness already apparent in the quality of her first cry and her father's observant stillness in the way she looked around the room with an expression of systematic assessment that made John say, the first time he held her, "She's already thinking about something." "She is her father's daughter," Ada said. "And her grandmother's namesake," John said. And it was said with the respect of a man who had come to know Miriam Keller through Ada's stories, and through the brooch with the garnet, and through the quality of the woman her daughter had become. Heinrich was 3 years old when Miriam arrived, and he greeted her with the particular mixture of fascination and proprietorial authority that older siblings tend to produce. Within the first week, he had established himself as her primary protector and explainer of the world, a role he appeared to consider both solemn and central to his existence. John watched this and said to Ada quietly, "He's going to be trouble for anyone who tries to harm her." "Good," Ada said. Clara came to see Miriam and declared her the finest Dusty Creek production since Heinrich, which she had also declared a previous record, and the mathematics of this were cheerfully inconsistent but entirely sincere. Clara had over the years become the particular form of family that you build when you are far from the family you were born into, chosen, specific, irreplaceable. She had stories she never told and a past she had been protecting since before Ada arrived in Dusty Creek, and Ada never pushed for the full version, understanding that some histories are people's own and are not required to be shared. What Clara shared was this: her presence, her watchfulness, her food, which was excellent, her practical, clear-eyed love for the people she had decided to love, expressed in exactly the way that it needed to be expressed, and not a degree more or less. The summer of 1888 brought news from Santa Fe. The federal investigation that John's original case had set in motion had concluded its final proceedings, and the network of land fraud and corruption that had been operating in the New Mexico territory for nearly a decade had been formally and completely dismantled. The last of the associated cases was closed. The last of the land claims affected by the fraud were being reviewed, and where possible, compensated. It was not a perfect resolution. Several men who had materially contributed to the scheme had died before the process reached them, one of natural causes and two of other things. Ellen Marsh had been dead for 9 years, and no legal proceeding could undo that. The land that had belonged to Ada's family, and to dozens of other families similarly affected, had in most cases already been dispersed and could not be returned in kind. But the record was corrected. The account was established. The truth, documented and verified and placed in the permanent record of the Federal Land Office, was real and could not be unmade. John received the final notification on a Tuesday afternoon, and he came home and he told Ada, and then he went to the garden alone for about an hour. She let him go. She understood what the hour was for. When he came back inside, his face was clear in a way that she had not seen before on it, a specific clearing, the final weight lifted. She had soup on the stove, and Heinrich was building something complicated out of scraps of wood on the kitchen floor, and Miriam was asleep in her cradle by the window, the late afternoon sun falling across her in a warm bar of gold. John stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it all, and Ada watched him look, and she thought, "This is what it looks like when a man stops carrying what he's been carrying. This exact expression, this exact stillness, different from all the other stillnesses, the one that is rest rather than readiness." He came in and sat down at the kitchen table, and Heinrich, without looking up from his construction, said, "Papa, do you know how to make a joint that won't come apart?" John looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "I'll show you." He got down on the floor with Heinrich, and Ada listened to him explaining the basics of joinery in the same careful, exact way he explained everything that mattered to him, and Miriam slept in her bar of gold, and the soup simmered. She stayed at the stove and thought, Ada Keller who wanted a life, here it is. In the spring of 1889, New Mexico Territory was moving steadily toward statehood, still more than 20 years from being achieved, but already a subject of serious political discussion. And the practical implications of the transition were beginning to affect the way the land office operated, the way the law worked, and the specific kind of work that John was doing in Santa Fe. He came home from a trip to the capital with news that the land office was looking to expand its documentation and records function, and that there was a formal position being established that would benefit enormously from someone with Ada's particular combination of skills. "They want you to consider it," he said. Ada looked at him. "They want me to consider it, or you told them about me and they want you to tell me they want me to consider it." He had the grace to look slightly caught. "The second one," he said, "though their response when I described your work was genuinely enthusiastic and not performed for my benefit." She thought about it. She thought about Heinrich, 6 years old and building things. She thought about Miriam, 2 years old and already showing signs of the systematic assessment that would either make her formidable or exhausting, or, most likely, both. She thought about the kitchen garden and Clara and the evening walks and the way Dusty Creek had become, without her entirely noticing when, the place she was from. "I'll consider it," she said. She took the position in the autumn of 1889. It required a trip to Santa Fe twice a month, which was manageable with the arrangements they worked out and with Clara's cheerful willingness to be a presence in the house on those days, which Heinrich treated as an opportunity for the specific kind of cooking education that John's more restrained culinary range did not provide. The work in Santa Fe was good. It was exactly the kind of work she was made for: the documentation and preservation and organization of land claims and legal records in a way that would withstand time and politics and the particular chaos of a territory in transition. She was good at it in a way that was visible to the people around her, and the visibility was a new experience that she found she valued more than she had expected to. She had spent years being invisible in the most complete way that poverty and single womanhood in the 1880s produced. The seamstress work in Abilene, the careful coins, the unanswered letters, all of it done in a space where no one particularly registered that she was doing it. What she was doing now was registered. It mattered in a way that was official and documented and real. John told her once, after she had returned from Santa Fe with the particular energized quality she had after productive trips, that he thought she was becoming the most important records officer in the territory. "Don't exaggerate," she said. "I'm not exaggerating," he said. "I'm stating a documented fact. You know how I feel about those." She laughed. She looked at him across their kitchen table with the oil lamp between them and the children asleep and the New Mexico night outside the window. And she loved him with the specific and enormous love that is not the love of beginnings but the love of duration, the love that knows everything and has chosen everything again and again on each day that it has been allowed the choice. "John," she said. "Ada," he said. "I'm glad you were standing when you said my name," she said. He looked at her, a long, dark-eyed look across the lamp. "So am I," he said. "Every day, so am I." In the autumn of that same year, 1889, Ada looked around at everything she had built and everything she had been given and everything that had been taken and returned and transformed, and she thought, this is the life, the actual one, the one she had told a stranger she wanted before she knew his name or what he would mean to her. The one that had seemed like a thing people said, a vague gesture toward something better, until she had arrived in a dusty street in a rough town in the New Mexico Territory, and a man had asked her name like it was the most important question he could think of before doing something dangerous. She thought about the duel, the morning light, the shot, and John Lawson turning back to the street and saying Ada Keller like he had been keeping it for something. He had been keeping it for everything, it turned out. The garden grew. Heinrich grew faster. Miriam grew fastest of all because that was her nature, the quick first and the deep root second. Clara grew older and no less formidable. Thomas wrote from Oregon with news of Margaret and of the small piece of land they had purchased outside Portland, a beginning that sounded, in the language of his inarticulate warmth, like exactly the right kind of right. John's work in Santa Fe became foundational in a quiet way that suited him, the kind of contribution that does not make the newspapers but that makes the newspapers possible, the records and the documentation and the careful structure that holds things together over time. And Ada, who had wanted a life, had one. It was not simple, and it was not without difficulty, and it was not always what she had imagined on the road south from Abilene with her coin purse and her mother's fierceness, and her stubborn refusal to let the last of her family disappear without a fight. It was better than that. It was made of specific things, the brooch with the garnet, the garden in the morning, the way John's hands looked when he was explaining something to their children, patient and precise, the particular quality of light on the mountains at the hour that had become his hour in her mind, Clara's food and Clara's love, equally generous and equally real, Thomas's letters and the shape of their relationship, rebuilt from the wreckage of 2 years into something more honest and more durable than what it had been before. The work in Santa Fe that proved she had always been more than the circumference of her circumstances. And underneath all of it, the foundation, a man who had turned back from a completed duel on a dusty creek morning and said her name like it was the thing he had done it for. He had asked her name before the duel. He had made sure he was still standing when he used it, and standing beside him, in every sense and on every day that followed, was exactly where Ada Keller had decided she belonged.